pace at which a nation grows its wealth is the most closely watched metric by economists and policymakers. Politicians boast about it in election campaigns, and central banks use it to set interest rates. It's the go-to measure of a nation's success and weakness. After the global financial crash that started in 2007, UK GDP fell by 6%. This marked the deepest recession for 80 years. The impact on people's lives was severe, with large falls in wages, restricted access to credit, and many people losing their jobs. So how is GDP calculated? In 1665, William Petty devised a basic concept of gross domestic product to challenge unfair taxation during the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Today, the Office for National Statistics collects data from thousands of UK companies, and GDP can be calculated by totalling the value of goods and services produced, otherwise known as output.
GDP is good at doing what it says on the tin, and that is to measure output in the economy. And what we mean by output is effectively all the money that's spent within a domestic economy, so not including money spent abroad, but even all the money spent, all the income earned within a country.
Other methods include totalling income or what the country has spent. These are three ways to estimate the same thing, but the problem is there's never enough data to build a complete picture of the economy.
GDP tells us how big the overall share of income is, or the overall pot of income. It doesn't tell you who's receiving it or where, so which households and which part of the country is it concentrated here or there. And that's important for, for people's well-being and their happiness.
The last measure, total spending, is perhaps the most familiar and can be calculated by adding up consumption, government spending, investment and net exports. Household spending forms the biggest part, accounting for about 2/3 of GDP, while a business buying new equipment or a construction company building houses are examples of investment. But is GDP really our most reliable metric?
If you're only measuring GDP, you become blind to these other outcomes, and these are often called negative externalities. And what we mean by that is things that aren't captured in the price. And many have argued that the environmental catastrophe that we're heading towards is perhaps the greatest negative externality we've ever seen, and almost makes the whole concept pointless. If something that big can be an externality, then the metric's really failing.
In China, some bureaucrats have reportedly fiddled the data by getting factories to produce goods for the sake of hitting GDP targets, leaving the calculation open to manipulation. But manipulation isn't the only concern when evaluating a nation's GDP as a standard of its success. GDP also doesn't take account of how environmentally responsible a country is, or how much inequality there is between its richest and poorest people.
When we've got people who are out working but also juggling caring for children, caring for a disabled partner, for instance, and they're also worried about whether they're going to fall into homelessness because they can't keep up with the rent, I think we all know that that's not right in our economy, that's not how we want our economy to function. So I think the important thing isn't to get rid of GDP, but it's to say it tells you one thing. We need to make sure we focus on the other things which are important to people's lives.
There are numerous items of value that are uncaptured in GDP because no money changes hands. As Robert F. Kennedy said in his 1968 presidential campaign, GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile.
And to give an example of that, if you ask your parents to help you care for your child, rather than paying for a nursery, the economy shrinks overall. Nothing's really changed, the child is still being looked after, may even be higher quality care, but the economy shrinks because no money has changed hands. So there's value there, but no money, and GDP isn't capturing it. Of course, this isn't a problem more broadly, it's a good thing if we're caring for each other, but it is a problem if we're failing to capture it in our primary measure of success.
You've also got to take into account changes in the size of the population. For example, if UK GDP rose by 2% next year, but the population grew by 4%, then the average income per person would actually have fallen. Which leaves the question, what other measures of our progress are there? Shouldn't we be measuring our overall well-being or happiness?
Although subjective well-being, whether you or I say we're happy and what makes us happy is important, what's really important from a policy point of view and from the point of view of having other measures alongside GDP is what can we measure objectively that's really important to happiness. Things like air pollution, things like child poverty, things like the distribution of income should all be considered alongside GDP as really prominent measures of how well our economy is doing. These things are kind of objective determinants of happiness, and those are the things that we should be measuring more.
But if we're looking at the health of a nation, shouldn't we be looking at physical health as a metric?
I think a good place for us to go would be one where governments are expected to tell us what their goals are. And it might be that they'll say, right, well, it's just GDP, but they'll have to justify that. And I think they would struggle to do so if they were forced to answer that question. But better still, they would put forward other measures of what they think are important to social happiness. And then, elections should be allowed to decide. And our public bodies, whether it's the Office for National Statistics or the Office for Budget Responsibility, they should be assessing government at how effectively government is delivering on those objectives and communicating back to society so they can make their mind up through democracy.